When the phone rang, I was standing at the sink, monotonously rinsing greens for dinner. The phone vibrated on the table. I glanced at the screen. The number was familiar but long forgotten. Kevin, my stepbrother, whom I hadn't seen in over 7 years. Hi! His voice sounded cheerful, as if we'd just parted yesterday. I'm in town and thought I'd stop by for a couple of days. The words felt less like a request and more like a decision already made. I froze, feeling the warm water trickling down my wrists. What could I say? No? But what difference would it make? Of course, I managed to reply, though my heart clenched uneasily. Even before hanging up, my mind drifted back to the past. Kevin had been that brazen teenager who never knew when enough was enough. Loud, self-assured, with inappropriate jokes and an intense gaze that made you want to look away. The last time we saw each other was at our father's funeral, and even then, he somehow managed to do something annoying. Now, standing in the empty kitchen, I felt the anxiety slowly creeping over me. I began wiping down the counters mechanically, as if cleaning could rid me of the weight pressing from within. Roast chicken, rice, salad. I tried to prepare something that wouldn't take much effort, but would still look decent. My husband was working late, and the thought of facing Kevin alone only added to my unease. I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror. Tired eyes, slightly disheveled hair. Pull yourself together, I ordered myself. But something inside whispered, this visit wouldn't be simple. The doorbell rang unexpectedly loud, as if Kevin wanted to remind me of his casual manner of showing up unannounced. I opened the door and hesitated for a moment. In front of me stood a man I could barely recognize. He had changed, grown. His face was sharper, the angles of his jaw emphasizing a newfound confidence, and a light stubble added an air of charm. He was dressed in a dark blazer and trousers, with a silk scarf loosely tied as if to tease. In his hands was a bottle of expensive whiskey, the kind my husband would undoubtedly appreciate. Here I am, he said, tilting his head slightly to one side. His smile was warm, but too familiar to be comforting. He stepped forward and hugged me, holding on just a bit longer than necessary. I tensed, catching a whiff of his expensive cologne and the self-assuredness with which he entered my home. When he finally let go, his gaze swept across the living room as if appraising the decor. Cozy. It feels like your style, he remarked with a tone that bordered on mockery. Thanks. Come in, I replied, trying to keep my tone steady. Inside, something gnawed at me. The sense that I'd just let in someone who knew exactly how to turn everything upside down. We sat at the table. Kevin poured himself some whiskey without waiting for an offer and raised his glass. To old times. I forced a strained smile, pretending to be preoccupied with serving the salad. But his gaze, sharp and probing, made me uncomfortable. His jokes were pointed, as if crafted to hit vulnerable spots. He easily dredged up childhood memories, ones I would rather not revisit. Like the time I spilled juice on his new sweater and how he got back at me by hiding my school notebooks. He laughed, but there was something more in his words, something that left a bitter aftertaste. Remember how much you hated me for that? He said, looking straight into my eyes. I averted my gaze, pretending I was about to refill his glass. The evening dragged on. Kevin spoke with confidence, with humor, but there was an intangible undercurrent that kept me on edge. When I finally closed the door to the guest room behind him, the sigh of relief I let out was noticeably louder than I would have liked. The morning began with soft, gentle light filtering through the kitchen curtains. I tried not to dwell on last night, but the memory of Kevin's sharp jokes and his piercing gaze lingered. I brewed coffee, savoring the aroma, hoping for a moment to relax before the day began. But as soon as I sat down at the table, the kitchen door opened and there stood Kevin. Far too energetic for such an early hour, he looked as though he'd just stepped off the cover of a magazine. Casually styled hair, an easy smile, and a t-shirt that perfectly emphasized his physique. Good morning, he said, reaching for a cup of coffee. I flinched. He hadn't even bothered to ask. Hope you slept better than I did. Your couch is pure torture. I stayed silent, unwilling to engage with his provocations, but he had already seated himself across from me, studying my face with interest. You look fresh, by the way, he added. That dress suits you. Very feminine. His gaze lingered a fraction of a second too long, and I felt a wave of irritation rise within me. Tugging at the hem of my dress, I tried to change the subject. What are your plans for today? I asked, feigning focus on stirring my coffee. Oh, plans, he drawled, smirking. Right now, I'm just enjoying your hospitality. Maybe you could suggest something? A favorite park? Or perhaps a little house tour? He was clearly watching my every reaction, studying me like he was playing a familiar game. I tried to focus on my cup, but his comments felt loaded, each one bolder than the last. Before long, my husband joined us, and the atmosphere shifted slightly. Kevin quickly found common ground with him, his tone becoming less provocative. They discussed sports, politics, and the latest news, and for a moment I felt a sense of relief. But even in that tranquility, I couldn't shake the feeling that Kevin was constantly observing me, his gaze sliding across the room, searching for weaknesses. When my husband stepped out to take a phone call, Kevin reverted to his usual style. He made a remark about my perfect domestic skills, and I couldn't tell if it was a compliment or mockery. Hard to be such a homemaker, isn't it? He asked, leaning in slightly. Or is it just a natural talent? I didn't have time to respond before my husband returned, steering the conversation back to safer topics. But deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. After breakfast, Kevin unexpectedly suggested, "What if we visit the Modern Art Museum? I remember you used to be into that kind of thing. Or was that a long time ago?" I hesitated. His suggestion sounded almost innocent, but there was something subtle in his tone, as if he were testing me. My husband couldn't come. Work always had him tightly bound, especially on weekdays. I'm not sure I have the time, I began, but my husband, barely glancing at me, interjected, "Go, you love art. It might do you good." Catching the faint note of encouragement in his words, I reluctantly agreed. The museum greeted us with the cold sheen of glass walls and minimalist halls. At first, walking beside Kevin felt strange, but to my surprise, he behaved impeccably, discussing the exhibits with an almost professional interest. We stopped in front of a massive canvas covered with chaotic splashes of vivid paint. "What do you see?" he asked. I studied it closely. The painting seemed like a mix of chaos and intent, something mesmerizing in its disarray. "Freedom, or maybe the illusion of it," I replied honestly. He nodded, but a faint mocking smile tugged at the corners of his lips. "Interesting. I see an artist desperately trying to create something out of nothing," he said. "Maybe it's a reflection of relationships. You know, when there's the appearance of something, but inside it's empty." I turned to him sharply, but his face remained calm, as if he had let the thought slip unintentionally. He moved on to the next exhibit without further explanation. "Have you always lived like this?" he asked softly. "Behind glass, hiding what's inside?" "What do you mean?" My voice wavered, though I tried to maintain a confident demeanor. He looked into my eyes, his gaze so intense that I wanted to step back. But instead, I froze as though rooted to the spot. "Nothing. Just thinking," he said, smiling again as if brushing off the moment. We ended the day with dinner at a trendy restaurant Kevin had chosen. The atmosphere was effortlessly elegant, dim lighting, soft jazz playing in the background. Kevin was a captivating conversationalist, almost too captivating. "You carry yourself as if everything is under control," he remarked at one point. "But I get the sense you're terrified of even the slightest deviation. Am I right?" I responded too sharply. "You don't know anything about me." "Maybe, but sometimes it feels like I know more than you think," he replied with a disarming smile. The idea of a trip to the countryside park came from my husband on Saturday morning. "A walk in nature will do us all good," he said. glancing briefly at me and then at Kevin. Fresh air, the river, a picnic. What do you think? Kevin immediately agreed, as if he had been waiting for such a suggestion. His enthusiasm was exaggeratedly effusive, but my husband didn't seem to notice. I agreed without much enthusiasm, hoping that the presence of nature would indeed ease the tension. The park welcomed us with the scent of pine trees and the gentle murmur of the river. The three of us walked along a path as the sunlight filtered through the dense foliage, painting intricate patterns on the ground. Kevin, as usual, was the center of attention. He regaled us with stories of his travels, peppering them with witty remarks and amusing anecdotes. My husband laughed and looked relaxed, as if this Kevin were an old friend, not my stepbrother. But beneath this apparent ease lay something else. Every time my husband was distracted, Kevin's gaze became too focused, too intense. When he spoke to me, there was an elusive tone in his voice that made me uncomfortable. "Are you always this serious?" he asked at one point when we were briefly left alone while my husband went to fetch some water. "Sometimes it seems like you're afraid to let go." "I don't know what you're talking about," I replied, keeping my tone as curt as possible. But he just smirked, as if taking my answer as confirmation of his thoughts. After lunch, we strolled along the riverbank. My husband walked ahead, taking in the scenery, while Kevin lingered beside me. He shared something light and humorous, but his tone suddenly shifted. We stopped by the water, so clear it mirrored the sky, and he spoke in a quieter voice. "You've changed. I don't remember you being this strong. Or is it just a mask?" "Maybe you just never knew me," I shot back. "Maybe," he admitted with a nod. "But sometimes I feel like I understand you better than you understand yourself." His words stuck in my mind. I turned away, pretending to look at the river, but I could feel his gaze burning into my back. My husband called out to us from a distance, and I hurried toward him, leaving Kevin behind. All day, I tried to make sense of what was happening. Was there genuine curiosity in his words, or was this just another game he was playing? Kevin had never been straightforward. It was a day full of hidden undercurrents, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still pulling invisible strings, orchestrating my reactions just the way he wanted. The next day, I decided to work in the garden behind the house. Physical labor always helped me clear my mind, and the yard had been needing attention for a while. The pruners in my hand clicked confidently, cutting away the dead branches of bushes as I focused intently on the task at hand. The weather was warm, but a gentle breeze offered some relief. I placed the watering can near a flower bed, preparing to transplant some flowers, when I heard a familiar voice. "Didn't think you were so fond of getting your hands dirty." Kevin stood by the gate, his usual smile on his face. He wore light trousers and a rolled-up shirt, as if he were heading out for a stroll, not into the garden. "What do you want?" I asked, trying to keep my irritation in check. "I thought you could use some help," he replied, stepping through the gate without waiting for an invitation. "Besides, it's a great way to spend some time, don't you think?" Before I could protest, he had already picked up the pruners and started trimming the bushes nearby. His movements were confident, and to my surprise, he wasn't in the way. We worked in silence for a while, and the quiet felt almost comfortable. "Do you remember when we used to help Mom in the garden as kids?" he suddenly asked. "I remember," I replied curtly, not wanting to delve into memories. "You always did everything perfectly, even if it was just the vegetable beds. That's so you, isn't it? Everything has to be perfect or you start to worry." "I just like things to be in order," I responded dryly. He smiled but said nothing more. We continued working, chatting about neutral topics. The weather, plans for the day, a few shared memories. At one point, I even laughed when he recounted how, as a teenager, he had once mistaken his mother's cream for toothpaste. The laugh came so unexpectedly that I surprised myself with how easily he had drawn it out of me. "See? You can be normal," he said with a warm smile, "without all those walls." "What's that supposed to mean?" I squinted at him, feeling a flicker of irritation rise again. "Nothing," he said, shrugging. You just remind me of a garden with too much fencing. When the garden was finally tidied up, I straightened, wiping the sweat from my forehead, and surveyed my work. Everything looked neat, even beautiful. But something about Kevin's words lingered in my mind. I tried not to dwell on what he meant, but his ambiguous phrases, his confidence that he somehow understood me better than I understood myself, were beginning to grate on me more and more. I couldn't shake the feeling that this help in the garden was just another way for him to get closer. And that realization only strengthened my resolve to keep him at a distance. That evening, I was preparing dinner. The stove hummed softly, pasta bubbled in a pot, and fresh vegetables waited their turn on the cutting board. I tried to focus on the simplicity of my tasks, but the events of the past few days wouldn't leave my mind. Each encounter with Kevin felt like the tension between us was growing, like a string pulled taut. When I heard the kitchen door creak, I already knew who it was. Kevin entered silently, like a predator, but his presence immediately filled the space. "What smells so good?" he asked with a light smile, leaning over my shoulder. "Pasta with tomato sauce," I replied curtly, continuing to chop the tomatoes. "Sounds delicious," he said, stepping closer. "Let me help." He reached for a knife and began slicing vegetables, standing beside me. I wanted to protest, to tell him I could manage on my own, but something about his confidence silenced me. We stood side by side, and I couldn't help but notice his hand brushing mine. Too often to be accidental. "You're really good at this," he remarked, slicing a bell pepper. His voice was soft, but there was an undertone I couldn't quite place. "Your husband is a lucky man. The perfect wife. Cooking, cleaning, working. You're like a picture-perfect dream." I took a deep breath, trying not to react. "It's just dinner, Kevin. Don't make it something it's not," I said, striving to keep my tone calm. But he continued, tilting his head slightly. "I wonder what's behind all this. You know, behind the perfection. Have you always been like this, or is it just a facade?" "Stop it, Kevin," I said, meeting his gaze. "I don't know what you're trying to prove, but enough." He didn't look embarrassed or remorseful. On the contrary, his smile widened as if this was exactly the response he had been hoping for. "Relax," he said, as though I were overreacting. "I'm just trying to get to know you better." I wanted to say more, but at that moment, my husband walked into the room. Kevin immediately switched to a lighter tone, acting as though nothing had happened. When dinner was ready and we sat down to eat, I could barely force myself to take a few bites. Kevin acted as if the incident in the kitchen was a harmless joke, but inside, I was boiling. I knew this wasn't the end. He was just getting started, and I had to stay on guard. The next day, my husband suggested a picnic by the lake. His proposal was cheerful and optimistic. Kevin immediately agreed, and though I hesitated, I didn't object. Perhaps the outdoors would truly help me clear my mind. We packed a basket with food, grabbed some blankets, and set off. Kevin brought along a camera, an old but expensive model that seemed to be more than just a toy to him. "I love capturing moments," he explained, fiddling with the lens. "It's like stopping time." My husband enthusiastically embraced the idea, thinking it would add a special touch to the picnic. I only nodded, but inwardly I tensed. Something about the way Kevin said those words made me feel like I was becoming part of another one of his games. The lake was peaceful. We spread a blanket on the grass, under the shade of some trees that protected us from the blazing sun. My husband busied himself with fishing, leaving me alone with Kevin. He sat nearby with his camera, snapping pictures of everything around us. Trees, the water, even our picnic basket. "Do you mind?" he asked, pointing the lens at me. "Stick to landscapes," I replied, trying to keep my tone neutral. "But you're part of the landscape," he said with a faint smile. I turned away, trying to ignore the sound of the shutter clicking as I adjusted my hair or gazed into the distance. His attention felt too sharp, like a spotlight aimed directly at me. When my husband became fully absorbed in fishing, Kevin moved closer. He set the camera down on the grass, finally leaving it alone. Have you ever wondered how things could have been different? He asked suddenly. What do you mean? I replied, though I knew it would have been wiser to end the conversation there. All of this. Your life, your marriage. It seems like you've got everything under control, but you must ask yourself questions sometimes, don't you? I looked at him, feeling the words catch in my throat. His tone was soft, almost friendly, but there was something else lurking beneath it. He spoke like someone who knew more about me than I wanted him to. Why are you asking me these things, Kevin? I said, doing my best to keep my voice steady. Just curious, he replied with a small shrug. You're strong. It's admirable. His gaze was unwavering, and there was something in it that made me feel exposed. I turned away, focusing on the lake, searching its calm surface for some kind of anchor. My husband shouted something about a fish, and I seized the opportunity to rush over to him, leaving Kevin alone. That picnic left a strange aftertaste. Once again, Kevin had tried to inch closer, using his words like hooks I was determined not to bite. His admiration, his subtle insinuations, it all felt like part of a game, the rules of which only he knew. One thing was certain. I needed to stay on guard until he left. And I needed to shut down his attempts to breach the boundaries I was fighting so hard to maintain. The house was filled with the familiar sounds of daily life, the clatter of dishes, the hum of the dryer, the muffled voices of the news from the living room. My husband, as usual, was tinkering with tools in the garage while I tried to fix the dryer, which had chosen the worst possible moment to break. Kevin appeared unexpectedly, as always. Need some help? He asked, already crouching beside me without waiting for an answer. I've got it, I replied curtly, but he had already taken the screwdriver from my hands. Well, if you insist on doing everything yourself, he said with a smirk, maybe it's time I learn how to be a spectator. I rolled my eyes but didn't respond. Inside, I was boiling with irritation, but I didn't want to give him the satisfaction of knowing he was getting to me. Kevin continued working, and within a few minutes, the problem with the dryer was nearly solved. As I leaned forward to attach the final piece, his lips brushed against my cheek in a fleeting, deliberate gesture. What are you doing? I hissed, stepping back. Relax, he said, that same self-assured smile that had been haunting me these past days plastered on his face. Just wanted to say thanks. At that moment, the garage door opened and my husband appeared in the doorway. His gaze fell on us, and a tense silence blanketed the room. I tried to say something, to explain, but the words stuck in my throat. Kevin didn't even bother to step away or offer an excuse. His face remained calm, unbothered. Is everything okay? My husband's voice was low and sharp. Yes, of course, I said quickly, desperate to brush it off, but his expression betrayed doubt. Is there something I should know? He asked, his eyes locked onto Kevin. Kevin merely shrugged, as if the situation were a ridiculous misunderstanding. Nothing important, he said. We were just fixing the dryer. But my husband wasn't convinced. He turned abruptly and walked out, slamming the door behind him. I ran after him, trying to explain, but no matter what I said, he only repeated, I need time. Just leave me alone. Left alone in the house with Kevin, I felt trapped. He walked into the kitchen as if nothing had happened and began pouring himself a glass of water. I followed him, my patience hanging by a thread. What is wrong with you? My voice was laced with fury. Calm down, he replied, as if my reaction were unwarranted. It was just an innocent gesture. You're taking this way too seriously. Innocent? Do you even realize what you've done? You're destroying everything, I said, struggling to keep from shouting. I'm not destroying anything, he said, meeting my gaze with unnerving steadiness. Maybe you're just afraid to face the truth. Get out, Kevin. Just leave before things get worse, I said, panic bubbling beneath my anger. He shook his head slightly, smiling as if he were enjoying my turmoil. Fine, he said. but don't forget who you really are." His words felt like a veiled threat, and as he disappeared into his room, the house sank into an unbearable silence. Everything was unraveling, and I had no idea how to piece it back together. Kevin left the next day, leaving behind a troubling emptiness that seeped into every corner of the house. His goodbye was dry and businesslike, as if nothing had happened. He gave me a glance full of unspoken meaning and walked away, leaving me to deal with the aftermath. My husband returned later that evening, but he was no longer the man I had shared my life with. His face was cold and distant, as if an invisible wall had risen between us. "We need to talk," he said, avoiding my eyes. "I know," I replied, bracing myself for any unpleasant truth he might voice. But instead of speaking, he slowly shook his head. "I don't know what was going on between you two," he began, his voice low and rough with suppressed emotion. "And honestly, I'm not sure I want to know. But what I saw yesterday, I can't unsee it. It's not what you think." I tried to explain, but the words sounded hollow, even to me. He let out a bitter laugh. "Not what I think," he repeated, finally looking me in the eye. "Then tell me what it was. Explain why I feel like something between us is broken." I opened my mouth but couldn't find the words. Any explanation would sound absurd. He had seen only the tip of the iceberg, but even that was enough to shatter what we had built over the years. "I need time to process all of this," he said at last. "I'm leaving for a few days. Please don't try to stop me." He grabbed a bag he had already packed and walked out, leaving me alone in the house where every room now felt like a reminder of what had happened. The days that followed were the longest of my life. I wandered through the empty house, filling my time with work and chores, but there was no escaping my thoughts. Kevin had disrupted the order I had worked so hard to maintain, but was it all his doing? I recalled his words. "Maybe you're afraid to face the truth?" What did he mean? Was there something within me that left the door ajar, allowing him to step in and shake the foundation of what I thought was unshakable? Or was it just another manipulator's trick, a game he played to enjoy breaking other people's lives? Each day without my husband reminded me of how much I stood to lose. The marriage I had thought was solid turned out to be fragile, like porcelain, and all because of a moment I couldn't prevent. But I knew one thing. If there was even a chance to fix this, I had to be ready to fight. For him, for us, and for myself. A week passed in a blur of unanswered questions and sleepless nights. The house began to feel like a theater of shadows, every object saturated with memories of recent events. I was lost in thought, trying to understand where I had gone wrong and how I could possibly make it right. When my husband returned, he looked thinner and exhausted. His steps were slow and his eyes avoided meeting mine. But he came back. That alone meant that not everything was lost. "We need to talk," he said, setting his bag by the door. I nodded, barely holding back the emotions threatening to spill out. We sat at the kitchen table, the place where we had always shared our simplest and most honest moments. Now it felt unfamiliar, distant. "I'm still angry," he began, his voice quiet but firm. "And honestly, I'm not sure I can ever forget this." "I understand," I whispered. "But please let me explain." I told him everything. How Kevin had been trying to disrupt our peace from the start. His words, his insinuations, his provocations. I didn't try to justify myself, but I was as truthful as I could be. I admitted that I hadn't set boundaries early on, that I had been too unsettled to recognize what Kevin was doing. But I never wanted any of this to affect us, I concluded. I know it's my fault, and I'm ready to do whatever it takes to fix it. He sat in silence for a long time, staring into the cup in front of him. Finally, he looked up. "Why didn't you tell me sooner? Why did you let him get so far?" I sighed, the weight of his words pressing down on me. "Because I was afraid it would destroy everything we have. And I was wrong. By hiding it, I made things worse." He nodded, his face still tense, but there was a flicker of understanding in his eyes. "I want to try," he said after a long pause. "But this won't be easy. I need time to think, to rebuild trust." "I'll wait as long as it takes," I replied. The days that followed were cautious, like walking on thin ice that could crack at any moment. We made an effort to be kinder to each other, to speak more than we usually did. Every word, every smile felt like a stitch mending the tear that Kevin had left behind. But most importantly, I began to re-examine myself. My habit of hiding fears behind a perfect facade, my reluctance to address problems until they grew too big to ignore. It was a long and painful process, but I knew that if I wanted to save our marriage, I had to change not just our relationship, but also myself. One evening, we sat on the terrace, watching the sun dip below the horizon. My husband suddenly turned to me. "You know," he said, "I was thinking maybe we could go somewhere. Just the two of us. Get away for a while. What do you think?" Warmth spread through my chest. It was a small gesture, but it carried a glimmer of hope. "I'd love that," I said with a smile. He took my hand, and for the first time in a long while, I felt that something between us was beginning to heal. It was only the first step, but it meant we were moving forward. Together. Several months passed. Kevin no longer appeared in our home or in our conversations. His visit was relegated to the past, though echoes of those events occasionally resurfaced. My husband and I were slowly but steadily rebuilding our marriage. It wasn't just a journey toward mutual trust, but also a deep dive into understanding ourselves. I began spending more time alone, reflecting on what aspects of my personality had allowed the situation to spiral out of control. Insecurity, a desire to please, fear of disappointing others. These feelings had been part of me longer than I had realized. But I resolved to change them. At first, it was hard. Old habits are stubborn. Yet every small effort, an honest conversation, a genuine look at my feelings, allowing myself to be vulnerable, became a building block in creating a new version of myself. My husband had changed too. He became more attentive, often asking what I was thinking or how I was feeling. We relearned how to listen to each other, and these simple acts helped us grow closer. One evening, as we were preparing dinner together, he suddenly asked, "Do you ever think about how things might have been if he hadn't come?" I froze for a moment, not expecting the question. Then I looked at him and answered honestly, "I do. But I've realized something important. His visit showed us things we needed to see. Not just about him, but about us." He nodded, his face calm but his eyes reflecting agreement. "That's true," he said. "We've reevaluated so much, and maybe we've come out stronger for it.